أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ألم تر كيف فعل ربك بأصحاب الفيل ألم يجعل كيدهم في تضليل وأرسل عليهم طيرا أبابيل ترميهم بحجارة من سجيل فجعلهم كعصف مأكول صدق الله العلي العظيم. Have you not considered how your Lord dealt with the possessors of the elephant? Did he not cause their war to end in confusion and send down to prey upon them birds and flocks, casting against them stones of baked clay, so he rendered them like straw eaten up? Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Assalamu alaikum, welcome, and thank you all for staying for tonight's very exciting program. And thank you, Hussein, for that beautiful Quranic recitation. Before we start with tonight's program, just a quick announcement. Tomorrow there will be distribution of invitations for the Big Iftar program that we're hosting on the 27th of July. And so Brother Ali Walji is coordinating that from the brothers, and we'll be gathering at Hyderi at approximately 3:30 p.m. to go down and visit our neighbours, give them some dates and an invitation for the Big Iftar. So please do join in with that. So as you all know, today's program is entitled Iraq, Past, Present and Future, and you can join in with the discussion online. The hashtag is #IraqPPF. Now, I believe that unfortunately the online streaming is down, and so unfortunately that we don't have those facilities today, but the program shall be uploaded onto YouTube as soon as possible afterwards for those who are unable to join us. Now, as I mentioned, the topic of today is Iraq. I know there are many other burning issues that we do have. However, I am going to request that we keep all questions on point. If I feel anything is going off point, unfortunately, we will have to move on as we are focusing on Iraq only today. Now, before I hand over to Miqdaad, just a quick introduction. Miqdaad works in finance, previously as a management consultant, and now works in strategy. In his spare time, he's a social and community activist with special interest in community development. He currently serves as a member of the executive committee at Mehfil and is part of the project team of the Salam Center. He's also an advisor to various charities, including IUS, and is the founder of a biggersociety.net blog site. He also actively partakes in both interfaith and intrafaith. He currently also serves as an advisor for the media team for the Muslim Council of Britain and is part of the external affairs team of the Council of European Jamaats. Miqdaad is also currently a third-year Hawza student and having studied under Sayyid Fadil Milani. So without any further ado, I'm now going to hand over to Miqdaad. Thank you very much. Can we please welcome with a loud salawat?
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Firstly, thank you very much for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to talk to you today. And hopefully the day will be productive for all of us and we'll be able to learn about what's happening in Iraq. And I'll be able to learn from you in terms of your ideas and your thoughts as well in the question and answer session later. What I'm going to be doing today is talking about four main areas. I'm going to give a brief background, an overview of the history of Iraq, just so we have some sort of idea of where we're coming from. What's happened just before the invasion time and after the invasion of Iraq. The key players and what's happened in 2014, the recent elections, and understanding that the very pivotal central figure of Prime Minister Maliki, who is instrumental and very important when we're looking at what's happening in Iraq right now. Once that background is understood, I think that's when we're in a better position to understand what's happening right now with the current situation with ISIS taking over in Mosul, and we can talk about some of the key issues there and what's worked well and what hasn't worked so well. And then finally, we'll talk about the future, and we'll have some time for questions afterwards. So, firstly, let's just give you a bit of background. So, I don't know if you can see the screen properly. I think you can. A lot of people don't know where everything is in Iraq. So, here's a picture. As a whole, you've got a lot of, so you can see where Baghdad is right in the center. When you start going right in the north, you've got the Kurdish area. So let's just look. You've got the Kurdish area right at the top. You've got a primarily more Sunni area underneath there, and that's where you've got big cities that you'll have heard of in the news: Fallujah, Tikrit, Samarra, and Samarra obviously having the shrines there as well, and Mosul as well. And in the south, you have your Baghdad, Karbala, Najaf, Basra, and Nasiriyah. Those are the main sort of areas, and it's just important to just think about where these are and look at the countries which are surrounding Iraq. You've got Iran on the right-hand side. You've got right being eastern side. You've got Turkey, Syria, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. And look at the long border with Saudi Arabia, the long border with Iran, and the border with Turkey. These are really important players, and they play a very important role in the geopolitical strategy of how everything works. And we'll touch on that. It's very, very important to understand how Iraq fits into everywhere else. The rest of the country, you know what Iran is, you know the political situation in the countries like Iran, Syria, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. We know a little bit about these areas, so keep that in mind when we start seeing what's happening with Iraq. Now, just giving a couple of figures which are important right now, about 30 million people, so half the UK. It's a huge area, this Iraq is. And in terms of sectarian split, you have 60% Shia, approximately, about 15 to 20% Sunni Arab, about 15% Sunni Kurd, and then 5% others. In other words, Christians, Turkmens, etc. And the vast, vast majority of the oil, 70 to 80%, is in the south, in Basra area, Basra, Nasiriyah, that kind of area. And a little bit, maybe about 20%, is in the Kirkuk and Kurdish areas. This is important. Again, this oil is a very, very big player in Iraq, and keeping that in mind on where it is hopefully going to be useful. Okay, now, I'm going to give you a short history of, in general. Start with Imam Ali alayhi salam's time, all the way then. Okay, so right at the beginning, civilization was flourishing in this sort of area. So Imam Ali alayhi salam moved the capital of the Islamic Empire to Kufa. Okay, so now we're already in the Najaf area, we're already in Iraq, and this is starting to become a central point. The Abbasids used, the Umayyads were there as well, and the Abbasids used Baghdad as the capital, again, in Iraq. So you can see that, and the Abbasids, during the Abbasids' time, there was significant economic development, ignoring some of the persecution of some of the people there, but there was a lot of economic development, and the civilization there was flourishing right at the beginning. You then had lots of invasions happening. The Mongols invaded, you had the Black Death killing a third of the population. This is like completely destruction of the civilization. And then you had the Ottoman period, and this is where the Turks came, and you have a developing country and a developing situation. Now, the Turks then chose the wrong side in the World War, and that meant that Britain and France helped divide up Iraq and the Middle East in general in something called the Sykes-Picot Declaration. I'm not sure if many of you will be aware. At a high level, the key thing is that the British and French, with their colonies, split up the Arab areas of the Ottoman Empire, and this is one of the reasons why you have the borders that we have today. And obviously, that's very, very dangerous. And ISIS even talk about ISIS. The terrorist group also talk about trying to reverse Sykes-Picot. That's how important this is even right now. And so what happened was the British took over the area. They built a monarchy here. So they built a monarchy in Iraq, establishing that. And then there was a military coup of that, and Britain came involved. They occupied the country. And there was a British mandate in place. That's the key thing. And Britain was in place from 1920-ish to about 1958. And that's where you started having the Ba'ath Party starting to take over. And the Ba'ath Party form the central pillar and the background for Saddam Hussein and a lot of the troubles that faced the Shia community in particular, as well as the Kurdish community in Iraq. And it was in 1979, similar time to the revolution in Iran, where Saddam Hussein took over the Ba'ath Party and took over control of Iraq. And what we have to understand when we look at Saddam Hussein is how bad he was. Okay, when we come on to later and we talk about execution and issues with that, we have to realize how bad Saddam Hussein was. He comes in place in 1979 in charge of a secular Ba'athi party. And in 1980, he he arrests and executes Shaheed Muhammad Baqir Sadr. And many of you who will be aware of some of the works and some of the thinking of one of our greatest scholars in recent history, if not ever, having been killed at such a young age is such a very, very big disappointment for the Shia community in particular. We have throughout the ages, even till today, people say, if only Muhammad Baqir Sadr was alive, etc. When it comes to finance, whether it comes to social mobility, whether it comes to politics, or whether it comes to fiqh and Islamic law. Saddam Hussein was the guy who executed him. It wasn't in a vacuum. He executed him. He executed a lot of his political opponents and religious individuals. Ayatollah Sistani, alhamdulillah, was able to be away from this kind of execution by being silent, and we can talk about the rights and of the political smartness and cleverness and strategic thinking of many of our esteemed scholars at a later stage when it comes to this political angle. Now, having killed Ayatollah Muhammad Baqir Sadr, this was also the time when the Americans started playing a bit of politics in the region. And we had the Iran-Iraq war. 8 years of 1.5 million people dying. 1.5 million. This is not a small number. We know how many. 1.5 million is a huge number of people being killed in a war. There were just bombs flying and people just fighting, and there's no particular reason. Nothing happened out of it. There was the targeting of the Kurdish population, 100,000 killed. And this is, the numbers are outstanding, and this is all Saddam Hussein's doing. Well, primarily Saddam Hussein's doing. And then in 1990, a couple of years after the end of the Iraq War, we have the invasion of Kuwait and the first Gulf War, the Americans coming to try and liberate Kuwait. And 1991 is key when the Shias rose up against Saddam Hussein as well as the Kurds, and they were brutally crushed with 100,000 dying. Throughout this last period after the Gulf War, we had sanctions where 500,000 people, or hundreds of thousands of people, were killed, according to Madeleine Albright of America. Now, that's until 2003. When the American invasion happened. And I'm just trying to give this context, to give the idea of how bad the Ba'ath Party were. We're talking about millions dying, hundreds of thousands being brutally executed and killed. It's a very important backdrop to have to our discussion as to how bad the Ba'ath Party were. And now, I think, on the next slide, there we go. You can't, okay, well, we have a situation where the invasion happens. Now, I'm going to try and go through this relatively quickly because there's a lot here. But the key points were when you had what's called the Coalition Provisional Authority in 2003 being set up, there were two key decisions that were made. The first decision was that all Ba'ath Party members were excluded from government, constitutionally. Well, that happened constitutionally was later, but the Ba'ath Party were excluded from government. This Ba'ath Party is the Saddam Hussein party, excluded from government entirely. Very important, has huge ramifications later on. One of the things to mention or to note, and that many people say is a big thing, is there wasn't this big de-Ba'athification to the extent that there was denazification in Germany. So in Germany, anyone who was a Nazi, they caught them, they exposed all the crimes that were done, and they got all the people who were involved and tried them, etc. That did not happen in Iraq. What happened was just they were excluded from government. And you can argue as to whether, had you gone further, whether some of the issues that we have today would still be there or not. That's a question that's up for debate. The second big decision that was made was to disband the army. And we'll come to the ramifications of those later. Okay, so the Americans come. They set up a provisional authority, and they talk to many of the key players in Iraq. Okay? In 2004, the next year, you started having a big uprising. And this was from different areas, the Sunni areas and some of the Shia areas in particular. From the Sunni areas, it was quite widespread, but also lots of the Ba'ath Party, because of the army being disbanded, came up, as well as some people who just didn't want America to be there. Remembering that a situation where a smaller proportion of the community used to run the country for so long and suddenly don't have any stake in the country at all, or a very small stake, it is very difficult to understand and to manage that process. And you had a lot of problems, and you had battles in Fallujah where people were literally, thousands were uprising and thousands were being killed, and it was a very, very dangerous time. The Mahdi army, led at least ostensibly by Miqdaad Sadr, militarized in this year. So it started probably a year earlier when the Americans came in, but it became an official army and militarized in this year, and we can talk about the reasons at a later stage, but I don't want to spend too long on that right now. In 2005, you had the beginning of democracy. Okay, so a couple of years, just, transitional authority, not really there. In 2005, you had an actual government formed, where you had elections, and Prime Minister Ibrahim Jafari, and you might have heard of him before, comes into power. What is very interesting is that the Arab Sunni community, in essence, boycotted this election. And that changes very much later. And you can see how important that is later. And in October, there's a new constitution which gets majority approval. So all of that happens in the early stages until 2006, where you have a full, proper elections based on the new constitution. And that's where Prime Minister Maliki comes in, because the Shia community basically comes together as an alliance, and they choose Prime Minister Maliki to lead. And this is the beginning of where we are right now. So now we understand where this Prime Minister Maliki, Nouri al-Maliki, comes from. It's the United Iraqi Alliance. And it was a very weak government, because it had a whole load of people with massively differing views. Right now in the UK, we have the Conservative Party and the Liberal Democrats working together. And we know that certain compromises have to be made. And in that situation, realistically, the difference between those parties is important, but comparatively is minor. When you go to Iraq, you have people who have a fundamental difference of opinion as to whether or not the state should be the way it is. Whether or not we need to have half the Ba'athification or the de-Ba'athification or not. Should you remove all remnants of Saddam Hussein, or can you keep them in? Fundamental questions about the country and how it will work in the future are differences in the government itself. And what that results in is paralysis. We know that, for example, in America, those who follow American politics will know that Obama can't do what he wants sometimes because the Congress party might have issues, and the Congress and the Republican Party in the Congress will not let him, and you have all these different structures in place to stop his power. Times that by 20 and you have the kind of issues that you have in Iraq. This is a fundamentally different and difficult situation, and you have a weakish government in that time. In spite of that, you have Prime Minister Maliki overseeing the hanging of Saddam Hussein, and we'll talk about that later maybe. And then you start having problems in Iraq. For 2 years, from 2007 to 2009, this is where, so in 2006, 2007, you've had the Sunnis not really participating in the politics, and then you have a lot of people dying, a lot of battles happening, lots of insurgencies. And when Prime Minister Mali comes in this scheme of things where everything is where thousands of people are dying per month in these fighting, then that's where he starts doing a counterinsurgency operation. You have the US surge, and you have the counterinsurgency. And there are three things that Prime Minister Maliki does. One is against the Shia militias. So there were Shia groups who were killing people for sectarian reasons, mainly Ashab al-Haq and Mahdi Army, but we can talk. We don't need to go into the details. And Prime Minister Maliki started off with the Shia. He didn't go after the Sunni population who are fighting at the beginning. He goes after the Shia who are fighting and killing people for no reason. He goes and he is able to take back, if you like, Basra, which is the oil-producing region in Nasiriyah, and Baghdad. They become under the government control. So from something which is lawless to something which is now a state starting to form. Al-Qaeda in Anbar, in the province on the side, I don't know if you remember seeing on the front page, that was helped by something called Sahwa, the awakening councils. Sunni groups and tribes came together with the government in America to get rid of Al-Qaeda in that area. And then finally you had the Sunni militias in Fallujah and places. The government, together with American support, was able to take control again. Many thousands, many hundreds died in many of these places. But what you had, though, is a success of the government forming. You finally had a country under the government, okay? And then in 2009, 2013, you started having Iraq being able to own itself. So having taken over the country and have control, military control, the problem was that the Americans still had power, ostensible power, because when someone takes over your country, you can't just, there's certain executive decisions still made by the Americans. And it took a very, very brave decision by the Prime Minister of the time to say, look, I am not accepting the Americans staying here. And we'll talk about this later, actually. I'm not accepting the Americans staying here, and that resulted in Iraq having its own sovereignty. And you can see how important that was, because in 2010, Prime Minister Maliki retained his prime ministership, as well as in 2014. In this period, though, you'll see a lot of the benefits that happen in the next few slides. And after all of this, in 2014, we've had elections and ISIS coming into power. Not into power, ISIS attacking Mosul. And we'll come into all of these things in more detail. Okay, that hopefully gives you a bit of background as to what's happened. Now, these elections were so important in 2014. In the previous ones we talked about, remember that the Sunni community weren't even participating in these elections. And now you have the Sunni community participating fully. And so what did you have? You can see that Prime Minister Maliki, having been in power for all this time, still his party and his bloc wins the biggest seats, number of seats, 30%. It's not a bad number. I mean, that's a relatively strong grouping. The Sadrists get about 10%. The what's called the Supreme Islamic. Oh yes, I should move on to the next slide. There we go. So the Shia as a whole get 55%, 30% of which is state of law, which is Prime Minister Maliki. The Sadrists get about 10%. The Supreme Islamic Council of Islamic Council, it depends on how you call it. It can be ISKI, Islamic Supreme Council of Iraq, by Hakim and Bayan Jabr, get about 10%. Others, including Jafri and Fadila, get about 4%. The important grouping to think about is the Sunni or secular group get 20%. Okay, and remember this number, around 20%, which is approximately the demographic split of the country. And that's, you'll hear about Nujayf, you'll hear about Salih al-Mutlaq, and Ali Allawi being a secularist in the middle. And then you have the Kurds, okay? The third big player. When it talks about them, the two people who you actually care about are Barzani and Talibani. Barzani being someone who basically wants Kurdish independence, doesn't care about the unity of Iraq, and Talibani, who's the president, who kind of who likes Iraq and wants to be together with Iraq. And so the difference within the Kurdish group. And then Goran, who are relatively small. And then others who are about 5%. Again, not very big. But what you can see is that when you look at the whole picture, you can see how important the State of Law Party is and how much popularity it still takes after being in power for this long. And the reason why that's the case is because of a lot of the achievements of this government. And I want to a lot of people will talk about a lot of the problems, and I'm going to talk about a lot of the problems with this government in a second. But we have to understand the context. We have a situation where the Americans are in power until 2010. In 2009 is when they started withdrawing from cities. 2011 is when they left the country. Okay? So from 2006 up till 2010, Prime Minister Maliki didn't even have the power to do what he wanted. That's an important context. In the context of the fact that many people weren't fully bought into the process of democracy and the fact that there was a Shia in power. These kinds of things are very important when we start looking at the benefits and the great achievements of Prime Minister Maliki. Okay, so let's look at the areas where he has improved. Firstly, the economy and public services. So GDP going up from 2007, where it was about 37 billion, to 210 billion in 6 years. Now think about that. It's not small numbers here. Huge improvement in economy. What this means is your household income goes up from £800 a month from about 400, 500 pounds a month to about 850 pounds a month. Huge improvement. Just imagine if your salary doubled. I mean, that's the kind of thing that was happening. When house ownership goes up from 60% to 70%. When you have electricity basically doubling. However much electricity people were getting, it was doubling. So electricity was a big problem there. Not everyone was getting it. Doubling in the period when he was there. Education. Thousands of people, more people are being educated, schools being built, and a sponsorship scheme from Prime Minister Maliki himself, which was saying, let's go to other countries. We're going to sponsor thousands and thousands of young Iraqis to go to other countries to get education and come back. Huge, huge ideas on the long-term future of Iraq. And oil. Big, big, big discussions with huge oil corporations where they were able to get relatively good deals. And remember, this is a government who's struggling to keep alive with security, with thousands of people being killed, and at the same time negotiating huge contracts. And someone called Shahristani was instrumental in that, making oil work in the country. And a huge increase in the development for oil. And oil is one of the big drivers of this GDP and economic growth. Second, ensuring Saddam Hussein was executed. Now, this is highly controversial, and I fully am aware of that. And I gave the context of the fact that the Ba'ath Party was so bad. Millions dying, hundreds of thousands being killed. And one of the problems that was being faced, or issues, was that Saddam Hussein, he had a lot of the countries around, including Qatar in particular, were saying, you know what, let him come here. He can live the rest of his life here. And, you know, in exile, away from the country. One of the most difficult decisions to make was to ensure there was a quick trial, a trial of some sort, and we'll come to the validity of that trial maybe in due course, if someone wants to ask about it, and his execution and hanging. There's a lot to be said about the line that drew. The Ba'ath Party as a whole had to rethink everything. There's no chance of going back to the old regime anymore. There's no Saddam Hussein left. The entirety of it was a pivotal moment in the history of Iraq, and a very dangerous one, and it required a very strong person, whether you agree or disagree, and we'll come to the agreeing or disagree in the question and answers if you'd want. It was a very important and difficult decision, and at the minimum, from a political perspective, a very brave decision. Right or wrong, we can talk about. Very brave decision. The next thing is getting rid of the Americans. So something called Statement of Forces Agreement, and the Strategic Forces Agreement later on, the SFA, whereby Prime Minister Maliki basically the Americans came up and said, look, here, we want to stay for the next 20 odd years. Here's an agreement. Are you okay? We'll help you with security. Is that something you're okay with? And Prime Minister Maliki and all the other parties were like, okay, you know what, the Americans are here. They're the only ones who can really control the country. Why not? You know, let them stay. It's fine. Prime Minister Maliki and the Dawa Party and the State of Law in particular said, no. We're the only one, the only party to this, said no. We're not going to accept this, and they negotiated very strongly. Two key points I will notice. One, they said Americans have to leave. Full stop. Have to leave. Number two, they said Iraqi territory will not be used under any circumstances for the attack of any of our neighbors. Think Iran, think Iran in particular. Those two particular clauses were added and made by the government and was seen as a massive victory. Just imagine a government who's very weak being able to deal with America and get the biggest concessions possible. Huge success and very, very powerful. Also removed sanctions. So one of the things that you want to get rid of is sanctions for your country. When you do that, is Chapter 7 under UN regulations, what happened was that Kuwait was saying, no, we don't want this. He was able to persuade Kuwait to withdraw its issue with that issue, with removal of sanctions. Next is retaining freedom of speech. Now in a country, think about the Middle East right now. Where are you allowed to say what you want to say? It's a bit difficult. Right till today, barring exceptions, and there are some exceptions which we can talk about, people are allowed to basically call Prime Minister Maliki a dictator, call Shias Safavi invaders, and all this kind of stuff. Freedom of speech is available in Iraq. Now think about, if we're talking about Prime Minister Maliki being some sort of huge dictator taking over the country, would he allow that kind of thing? Important thing to bear in mind. The next one is minimizing corruption. That's something that there's a sort of ceiling on private contracts. He said that, well, just imagine, I'll give you this one example. I think it was Ayad Alawi and somebody else at the time, the defense minister, spent billions in 6 months' time buying things like bomb. You know when you go to airports and you have to go through these security gates, They bought these things to make sure that certain areas are safe, that bombs don't get through. They bought thousands throughout the whole country, which just didn't work. And when they knew it didn't work, they still bought more. There was a corruption of a scale that was not heard of. One of the things that was done, there were lots of them, was to create a ceiling of private contracts so ministers could no longer do this in the future. But the key thing I want to talk about is security. And this is where really there was a big problem. And I'll talk about, let's go to the next slide where you can see this more. Yeah, there we go. That's when Prime Minister Malik was elected. What we've got here on the side is the number of deaths per month. And here you've got, at this time, you're getting 3,000 deaths per month when Prime Minister Maliki comes in. What does he do? The three things I talked about. Grand attacks against the Shia militias, followed by attacks with the Sunni tribes in Anbar, followed by victories with the American and the surge against the Sunni militias. And what does that do? What does that do to the number of people being killed per month? Now, none of this is acceptable. You don't want to have 100 people dying, 500 people dying each month. But look at what it was before. And under that surge and through that and a lot of other things, you suddenly had a much better security situation. And then afterwards, when the Syrian crisis happened, you suddenly get this upsurge, and we can talk about that later. So these are quite very dangerous, courageous decisions to go after the Shia first and go after Sunnis. So these Sunni groupings of, they're not broad-mash Sunnis, but the extremists amongst them, in particular Al-Qaeda elements within Anbar and others. And fighting against these militias and these people who are just killing people was very difficult and required a very strong character, and Prime Minister Malik was able to do that. But, and this is a big but, and I've talked a lot and very positively about Prime Minister Maliki so far, I need to emphasize that that just provides the backdrop. We need to bear that in mind before we start talking about the big problems, and there are big problems. Number one, that he did not build and control a stronger army. This is the biggest thing. It's very difficult. I can argue, he'll give you lots of excuses, and I can always explain. What we have to realize, though, is he's prime minister. The buck stops with him, right? People who support him will argue that actually it was impossible for him to do much because of the way the constitution works, and ministers are all independent of his own personal government. He can't go and tell other ministers to do what he wants. But the buck stops with him. And so everything here I'm going to talk about are issues that you could argue are not his direct responsibility, but he is the person who has to take accountability because he is the prime minister. So one, the army is not strong. We can see that in Mosul, what happened in Mosul. Number two, he surrounded himself, especially after in the second government, with people of what you might gather to be questionable competence. Incompetent might be another way of describing them. Might be. And these are people who maybe you could basically argue that it's nepotism, where he's put people who he finds loyal to be people around him. Now, it's important to realize that everyone does this, right? The Barzani has only his relatives. 3/4 of his group are just his relatives in the Kurdish area. The Sadrists, just recently we have people who are related to the Sadrists basically getting a much more prominent position than they otherwise would have got. Same with the Hakim family having a big role in ISKI or SCII. So their loyalty is fine. The question about competence is the big problem. And you had a lot of incompetent people in very powerful positions. That's there. Now, not dealing with corruption effectively. So I said that he's done some stuff for corruption, which was very good. But the thing was that you have, like the Iraqi central bank governor, he was wanted for financial manipulation. He gets away. The number of people who basically just ran away with millions and millions and millions of dollars is just it's unbelievable. And the buck stops with Prime Minister Maliki. Why did the government not able to stop these guys getting away with, literally billions and billions of dollars comes in through oil? I think the number I've seen is $700 billion of oil in the last 10 years. That's huge. $700 billion? Where has it gone? Huge mismanagement of resources. Huge corruption. And that is also under the government of Prime Minister Maliki. The government didn't build strong institutions. And you don't have what you call symmetric federal government. That's what they call in academic terms. What that means is the Kurds have quite a lot of power, right? In their own, they can do whatever they want in their area. In Nasiriyah in the south, even though they don't have any power to do what they want in their own area. So you have this very weird system where institutions not built, the governance is not right, and you don't have these structures and institutions where basic metrics are even tracked. Let's say, for example, poverty indicators. Nothing's done, right? There's a lot of basic structural work in a country that needs to take place when you've gone from invasion and you don't have a country to a proper functioning democracy. And a lot of that just didn't happen and hasn't happened. And then the next, again, I can only touch on all of these things because I'm already running quite late. So the next one is dealing with political leaders better. So in particular, Sunni political leaders. Nujayfi being one of the opposition party leaders, now he's someone who is so anti-government, it's unbelievable. But at one stage, before he sort of was going towards the Turkish area and sort of going more towards Turkey and anti what is now Iraq, he was potentially someone who could be talked to and worked with. But he didn't work with him. Prime Minister Maliki didn't work with him. Isawi is another situation, and he's a former finance minister. And, yes, the guy goes, these are ministers in the government going in public saying, the prime minister's a dictator. Okay, fine. If you're a random citizen, that's one thing. But just imagine if you've got Nick Clegg, let's go to someone else. Let's say you've got William Hague going out and saying David Cameron's a dictator. He'd get sacked the next day, everything would happen, right? But this is what was happening. Ministers themselves were saying this kind of thing. And so Prime Minister Maliki wasn't dealing with these guys and the problems that these were causing in a very good way. The next one is public relations of the West. Anyone who reads the news here will think the Prime Minister Maliki is some sort of crazy dictator who doesn't know what he's doing. There's a lot to be said about the importance of PR, and he didn't care about that, and that's really important. And one of the other most important things is crossing sectarian divide. Okay, what's important here is that principally you've got a government when Saddam Hussein is in power with very few 20-odd% people who are supporting that kind of idea. You now have a situation where the Shia are the majority and are going to basically have prime ministership in most situations. Maybe not all, but most situations. It is very, very important when you have this big change to work very hard to change the narrative. What I mean by this is get everybody to buy into the idea of representative democracy. It's a very difficult concept. If you used to run the country, and then suddenly you have one MP, one minister, it's very difficult to buy into this idea. If you're a minority, you don't see what you want happening. And it's very, very important to enshrine these minority rights, to make sure that people buy into this idea of democracy, whereby you can have certain things, but only as much as makes sense. That battle for the idea of democracy has not been won. A significant proportion of the community, in the Sunni community in particular, don't yet buy into the idea that there's always going to be a Shia prime minister. Assuming that everything stays by sectarian lines, which is likely to happen at least in the short foreseeable future. So all of these things are huge problems that are taking place under the leadership of Prime Minister Maliki. And I don't want to make everything about him, but it's important to think about these things, about the problems in Iraq. And all of that has to be the background of why Mosul, the city that we talked about, was lost. And that's a fundamental error by the government. And so what happened in Mosul? And that's very important to see. So, catastrophic is probably an understatement. Incompetent is probably an understatement. Ridiculous is probably an understatement. This is, of proportions that you could never see. A group of 1,000 people suddenly come over and take over a big city where 30,000 army troops are there, or were there. This requires incompetence, or not just incompetence, but people playing behind the scenes in ways that we would never imagine. And so how did this happen? 3 or 4 big things to think about. 1, the Iraqi army basically collapsed. You had generals saying, oh, you know what, you're an officer in this area, go home, it's fine. 30,000 people just left their post. They left all their weapons. Everything was just left there, went home. Why? Well, these generals have been sacked. I mean, just sacked, just now. But sacked and not arrested. Anyway, the army collapsed. One. Okay? For whatever reason. Number two, ISIS, so these crazy terrorist guys, basically got coalition with the Ba'athis. So in other words, the Saddam Hussein people, the people who used to be within the Ba'ath party, which Saddam Hussein used to lead, and the Sufi Naqshbandis. Okay? Everyone had an aligned interest here because everyone wanted to get rid of the government. The Ba'athis just don't like the idea of democracy because they don't get power. ISIS don't like the idea of Shias. Yeah. And then and the Sufi Naqshbandis have a very weird understanding of Shias as well as not liking the government at all. And so everyone was aligned in this idea. The third reason, the Mosul inhabitants. So Mosul has a lot of people who really dislike the government, very, very strongly anti-government, and that was something that helped this happen. Because if the inhabitants were against it, they'd have fought against ISIS. And then there's the role of Kurds, and that's really bad, but we don't have time to go into that. So what you have is you have ISIS, who are ridiculously harsh, beheading people, murdering all opponents, having Sharia law or whatever type you call it in those areas. Al-Qaeda consider them to be too extreme, and when Al-Qaeda think you're too extreme, hugely sectarian, thinking that Shias are kafirs and deserve to be killed, etc. Very organized, proper social media team, good propaganda going out there, and at the same time, they were also hated in places in Syria. So they took over places in Syria a while ago. They were from Syria. They took over places in Syria, and the people in those areas wanted to get rid of them because of how ridiculously harsh they were and everything. One of the cool things that you may notice is that they said no to smoking, and that's not a good thing to do in an Arab country. Okay, let's go on. So what that means is you have this really, really dangerous party taking over Mosul. What does that mean? Firstly, financial strength. They basically went to all these banks and they got $2 billion. I don't know how that amount of money is like left around, but $2 billion. You have military strength. They've suddenly taken over all of these army. They got tanks. They had a Scud missile. They had all this kind of stuff because it was all left there by these generals. Okay? They're now controlling these lands from Halab, from Aleppo in Syria, all the way to Mosul, at least parts of it. And they declare this idea of khilafah. Of a caliphate. Now what this means, what does this mean? What's the insight I can give you here? Well, think about it. If you're someone who hates the government, I mean really hates the government, and you suddenly see somebody, okay, they're a bit crazy, but they're getting rid of the government. Look, they're winning. They're winning, and they're saying that we're strong Muslims. We have a khilafah. You should follow us. Look, give me bay'ah, give me allegiance. I mean, clearly nonsense, but that's not the point. You have a rallying cry for people who want to hate the government. And this is why the loss of Mosul was so bad, because it meant that all these people could suddenly come together and say, we're going to fight the government. And that's why we have some of the problems that we have right now. So, what are the underlying problems that people are talking about? One, underrepresentation of Sunnis. Now, is this a fair thing to say? In short, not really. Because 60% of the population are Shia, and 25% are Sunni Arab, and they hold 30% of the government ministries, 65% of army positions, including the head of the army, and get a greater proportion of the budget than anybody else. So that's not a fair comment to talk about. Secondly, important to talk about, and is the role of the marja'iyah. Now, this is something that we don't realize as much. Like Ayatollah Sistani, we can't thank him enough. His role has been instrumental, fundamental in the country and the development of the country. He said stuff like "don't loot." I mean, these aren't complicated things to say. But when he says it, he doesn't say it for everything. He doesn't say get involved into the micro. And he doesn't, in general, get involved with politics in his thinking. And we can talk about that later if anyone's interested. But the key thing is, on specific issues of national importance, he has got involved in a very, very powerful way. Don't loot. He forced the idea of a transitional government rather than just the Americans making up. We need to vote on the constitution rather than just creating a constitution. He forced democracy and said that you can't just create, have elections or appoint people to be in charge. He said the Iraqis should vote. He made a statement, including all women should vote. He said very strongly all women should vote. Again, building this idea of democracy. And he talked about very powerfully, Sunnis are not just our brothers, but they are ourselves, our anfusakum, our very own selves. That's the kind of anti-sectarian message he was posing. And what he's done after Mosul. So when Mosul happened, when ISIS took over, what he did was he said, all capable Iraqis should fight the terrorists under the national forces. Not just Shias, although some people are saying that. All of them. What did this do? All the Shia community, even those who hated the government, and literally there were some who a week earlier had said, no, the government has to go. After this point, everybody was together against these terrorists. We don't understand how. People were thinking the country was going to collapse before this statement. This statement resulted in millions of people being ready to fight and defend the country against these terrorists. Noting that the terrorists shouldn't have won anything in the first place anyway, but that's another question. And so, what do I want to say next is the role of the media. Okay, so this is the third thing I want to mention. The Western media has been awful. Firstly, the way that they talked about the Iraqi death squads. This is the Times. I mean, they've got a picture there of ISIS killing people, ISIS killing Shias, and the title is actually talking about Shias killing Sunnis. I mean, it's just nonsense, right? How can you use a picture that's genuinely the wrong picture? I mean, here's another example. The Guardian's been awful. They've got understandably, Guardian cares about anti-war. That's its main message, anti-war. Anything that works anti-war is what they say. And they've just been promoting the idea that the government's failing at any cost. And you can see this right now. They talk about the fact that there's a fear between ISIS and Shia militias. ISIS is a terrorist group beheading people, and Shia militias are bad, but they're not beheading. There's a false equivalency here. We can't talk about this in that way. And finally, you've got the idea of the BBC, which really, as a public body, needs to know better. And it talks about a Shia cleric, Sistani, issues call to arms. Now, this is the amended title. The initial title said, Shia cleric Sistani issues call to Shias to arms, to fight Sunnis. What nonsense is this? He himself was very clear. The term used in Arabic was al-Iraqiyin al-Qadirin, the capable Iraqis, no Shia Sunni stuff. He's not like that. But that's how it was portrayed in the BBC and other media throughout. So, future of Iraq in the next 2 minutes. Firstly, the future is not bright. So there's three cases, three possibilities. One, the security forces take over. Okay, so we have a situation where the government wins. It's going to be difficult. The big way that this might happen is, we talked about these aligned interests, the Kurds and the Ba'athis and the Naqshbandi Sufis and ISIS all working together as well as acting as a rallying cry for other Sunnis. When they start fighting between themselves, like happened last week, what happens is that you have ISIS and Ba'athis fighting, and what does that mean? They have a weaker force. Government can start taking up bigger victories. And inshallah, that should be happening soon. But that's the optimistic scenario. If that happens, we'll continue having some sort of shaky democracy continuing. Or you have a stalemate. In other words, no one can win. No one's going to extend any further, which is bad. But you'll probably end up with a non-functioning state and potentially the splitting of the country. And the final worst case scenario, and let's pray hard. We've got Laylatul Qadr nights coming up, and we really have to pray that this doesn't happen. A complete civil war. And if that happens with ISIS taking power, in particular getting any foothold in Baghdad. We haven't had any suicide bombings in Baghdad right now. Why? We haven't had any big attacks on Baghdad. Because the security forces so far have been able to protect the area. With all these Shia militias as well, and people coming in because of the Sistani call, you suddenly have a very strong area supporting Baghdad, and at the moment it's holding. If ISIS were able to get a foothold in Baghdad, all hell can break loose. And we don't want that to happen. And again, that's going to result in not a no-functioning state. We'll have civil war and nightmare scenario. So, let's talk about the best-case scenario, because I like talking optimism. We're in Ramadan. Okay. For any chance of reconciliation, realistically, and this is my opinion, not necessarily the opinion of everyone, is that Prime Minister Maliki needs to go. Everyone hates, the other parties all hate him. Whether or not he's done a good job, that's up for historians or political analysts or us to make. But what we need is to think about what the alternatives are. And we've got many alternatives. The key things to think about, just remember these guys' names, Tariq, Najm, Shahristani, and Ja'fari, because they're people who might come up in the future. And finally, I'd like to end with what we can do here. 5 things. Anti-sectarianism. Let's work for interfaith. How many of us know Sunnis? How many of us know Sunni mosques? How close are we with the local Sunni mosques? We have to make sure that sectarianism doesn't spread here. That's very important. We need to make sure that we work, whereas others don't work, we work for for Islam to be a united religion. United we are strong. We can lobby the government to stop funding going to ISIS. We can hold the media to account when BBC act crazy. We can try and stop them acting crazy. We can unite in stopping people going to fund the terrorists or to fight with the terrorists, and we can use social media. So those are just some ideas, all of which we can talk about in more detail and in the next few minutes that I have left. Hopefully that will give you a good overview of what's happened in Iraq, and inshallah open to question and answers.
Thank you, Miqdaad, for that very comprehensive timeline. Can we have a loud round of applause for Miqdaad for fitting in so much information to a very short span of time? Now, we do have pizza on the way, so I am going to limit the Q&A if that's okay. But if we want to start off with the brothers first, we'll then move on to the sisters, and I'll let you know when it's time to come to a close. So just a general reminder, can you please keep the questions on topic to what Miqdaad has spoken about today, please?
Hi, thanks. Yeah, Bismillah. I wanted to ask you because BBC is obviously funded through the fee that we pay, license fee we pay. Therefore, we all have a stake in it. And I think a lot of ordinary people probably will find difficult to comprehend is how to lodge a complaint. Is it worthwhile making a complaint? Does it achieve a goal? It doesn't, and all these sort of things. And I think the BBC is also run by a trust, is it?
Yes.
Yeah. So again, I don't know whether there are representatives from minority communities who can be talked to, because it needs to be, it's a very critical issue, very critical importance what they say and how they portray things at the top level, and some pressure needs to be applied there. So I just wanted some ideas from you, basically.
So, thank you very much for the question. I think that there's a lot of very positive work that's being done. One thing that needs to be thought about, and this is a general point, is funding, okay? So if we as communities can put up the money to help the Shia community, then this all can be done very well. But at the moment, it's being done bit part. In BBC, the editorial team was contacted. There was a group that we were involved in, where the editorial team was contacted. They were sat down, discussions were had with them. There were 400 people who demonstrated outside the BBC, together with hundreds of people writing in complaints. Very easy, bbc.co.uk/complaints, or search BBC complaints, how to write a complaint, any of those things. On Google, you'll find it. Very easy. Write something, complain, you'll get a response. And I know for a fact that this works. So the BBC changed their headline. I mean, it's not a fantastic change, but they changed from attacking, literally being very sectarian, to being slightly less sectarian. You can only do this through lobbying, through long-term lobbying, through having Muslims or Shia Muslims or all Muslims of all types within the media institutions, and that's a long-term goal. But even on the side, if you want to do lobbying, you just need to have people who do it. And we need to pay to be able to get enough people to do this full-time and to be able to galvanize the community to make it happen. But it works. For example, Huffington Post US, they did something ridiculously sectarian on the same thing. I wrote an email, 5 minutes later I got things saying, oh, sorry, I didn't know about that. I can see you've got the right answer. I've changed it on the website. Like that. Some of these guys just don't know. We have to give some idea. Journalists are like all of us, right? They're not academics. They can't spend 10 years studying Iraq, understanding the intricacies of how Shia, Sunnis, all this kind of stuff work, and then suddenly making an article. Realistically, this guy yesterday was talking about a different topic. Today he's talking about Iraq, Shia, Sunnis. Next day he's going to talk about Shahristani and the political situation. They don't know this stuff well enough. We need to be there as an informative mechanism, but we can only do that if we have a lobbying place or an institution in place which can make this happen. Requires money. That's the problem that we have and we don't have with other communities as well as us. Hopefully that's...
Can we take a question from the sisters?
Can I just ask, how many complaints does it take for them to have a full investigation?
A full investigation, I'm not sure, but generally, because when it comes to Israel, when it comes to these kinds of things, when it comes to Israel-Palestine, every time something happens, they have 1,000 complaints about every time. So Gaza right now, they probably had 1,000 complaints. They don't investigate every single one. They just have a general policy. They look at, even if there's one complaint sometimes, if they can't deal with it, they might have an investigation. So it's not a numbers-related one, it's a quality one, and depends on how quickly up the line it goes, and depending on the weight of the complaint and the media it gets, etc. So it's a complicated thing. But you need a strong lobbying power to talk to the right people, talk to the right people at the right time, have the right people there, and complain in large enough numbers to make any real difference. And it needs all of those things together with that pressure, which worked to some extent with the BBC in this case.
Thank you very much. Could we please pass the mic over to the sisters' side? I believe they've got a question.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Just a quick question. What was Malik's involvement in the beheading of Saddam Hussein?
Yeah, so fundamentally he signs the death. Okay, so there's two things. One is he makes, as a prime minister, there was a huge amount of pressure for him to say, you know what, let's just take him to Qatar, it's fine, just let him go. Huge pressure, at a level that we don't understand the kind of pressure he was under. A lot of people were saying we don't want him to be killed here, right? We don't want that to happen. Of course, hell, everything will break loose. That didn't happen, but there was a lot of pressure. So he could have done that. He chose not to. Instead, there was a trial, okay, of specific people being killed. Very easy trial to win. Not the hundreds of thousands who were killed and all that kind of stuff, which would have taken 10 years to do. A specific trial. Then he signed the death warrant. He didn't have to sign the death warrant. He's the prime minister. You know, in the same way that you can, I don't know if you know that President Obama can sign something saying, oh no, this guy goes. He can give that kind of leeway. Prime Minister Maliki had the right to do that at that time. He chose not to. So he signed the death warrant. He ensured there was a trial. He signed the death warrant, and he made it happen without that many incidents. And those three things were very important in making that happen. Whether it should or not is a question of morality, etc., and all this kind of stuff, which has to be understood with the background of hundreds of thousands of people being killed by Saddam Hussein. Is that okay?
Can we have one more question from the brothers? I believe there's a question at the back.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Miqdaad, for the fantastic insight on the current situation in Iraq. Quick question regarding Syria. What influence has Syria had on the current situation in Iraq?
Very good question. Okay, so ISIS based in Syria is the key thing. I mean, you have, because ISIS are based in Syria, a lot of the terror and the weapons and the funding and everything's come through the Syrian channel into Iraq. So that's one of the key things that's played on the creation of the terrorists coming into Iraq. You have to realize that people in ISIS in Mosul, we have reports saying that these guys can't speak Arabic properly. These are just basically foreigners. They don't even know, I mean, they're just random people who are coming just for jihad to kill Shias, right? That's the kind of issue we're facing. And they came from Syria. That's the key part of it. And what you have is a very unfortunate situation where Assad, the Syrian dictator, is actually supporting killing ISIS. And obviously that means that Prime Minister Maliki, or the Iraqi government and the Syrian government, including Assad, are basically fighting the same enemy. And so what you have is the governments working together and the rebels working together. And that's where the problem has happened. Does that make sense? What? Yeah.
So how are ISIS funded then? Who are they funded by?
So, okay, so there are different bodies which are funding them. Okay, at the initial stage at least, there are claims, and all I'm going to say is claims because there's no way to substantiate a lot of this stuff. One, Turkey. There are people who are saying that the Turkish Erdogan's sons, their photos with Erdogan's sons together with some of the ISIS leaders. Saudi and Qatar, in general, not necessarily the government probably closed their eyes to this, but are aware of it, probably claims, reports, need to protect myself. A lot of funding is coming from Saudi Arabia and Qatar in particular. And this money is used to fund them at the beginning. Now, right now, that's where it's different, because they've just taken over a city. They suddenly have $2 billion. Some people say their total wealth at the moment is $5 billion. It's not bad, right? You can kind of fund poor people for quite a long time to fight alongside you. So that's where a lot of the funding is coming from, which is where we are right now.
I'm going to take the final question from the brothers, if anybody has a question. Okay, we'll make it 2 questions.
Thanks again for your presentation. On the slide before, could you just go back one? I think it was point 2. What is the current situation around the UK government funding, and how can we be more proactive in that?
So the UK government is not funding ISIS in any way. That's important to bear in mind. They have the ability to identify sometimes when funding is coming from Saudi Arabia or Qatar. One of the things that you want to know, there's this list, and I've forgotten which one it is. In particular, the Americans have this very well done, whereby they're able to get a person and basically freeze all their bank transactions throughout the world. Some of these Saudi royals don't really want that to happen to them. And there have been decisions made to allow this to happen. There is a potential that some of these kind of leniencies that have been given to certain people could be lifted, and we could suddenly have a lot harsher action against some of these funders from Saudi Arabia, Qatar, etc. If we can get the government to start working and lobbying the Americans and to make this happen, that could be very powerful in sort of stoking that funding and stopping it happening. But the UK government's not funding ISIS. It is, however, probably funding other rebels in Syria, but that's another question altogether.
Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Just a quick question from the Iranian point of view, and the way that they are reacting to the entire situation. For me, the biggest terrorists are the Saudi government and the Qatari governments who are funding this, and they're overseeing them, the ISIS group and the other groups. They've done this in Syria successfully. They've basically shifted that model to Iraq. They don't want Iraq to be successful. They've always had a history of problems between Saudi Arabia and Iraq. But if you look at the root cause of all of the problems, it's the Saudi government. And that's what my take is. And what's, from an Iranian point of view, but go back in a religious point, from the religious history point of view, Muawiyah did the same thing. If you look at the way Muawiyah operated and the way his media ran is not very different from the way the Saudis, the Qataris, and the Western governments are running their medias and their propagandas. At that time, it was Imam Ali. Imam Ali did create an army to fight Muawiyah. He was not sitting back waiting for ISIS cancer to spread even more. So what's the role of Iran in this entire region, and of course other Shia governments which also have superiority in terms of the Lebanon and south of Lebanon? Thanks.
Very good question. I mean, the foreign side of things I haven't been able to talk of as much, and this is a very big part of the geopolitical idea, and the idea that Iran and Saudi are fighting a proxy war in Iraq is an important one to talk about. Specifically on the question that you've talked about, Iran's already involved heavily. I mean, it's been involved from day one. It's in its strategic interest to make sure that its local neighboring countries are supportive of its national and strategic interests as well. And one could argue in its religious interest as well. But from a political angle, Iran's been involved from a long time. And right now, there are already some Quds brigades there helping fight against ISIS and look at it. What they should be doing and what they shouldn't be doing. Okay, lots of different angles of this. And one of the angles is Iraq decides what happens to Iraq, not Iran. A very important angle to bear in mind. Why should a foreign power, whoever that foreign power is, intervene in your country without the request of that country? So that's a very important position that many will hold. And I think that's a good starting point to think about. But so Iraq needs to make sure it's in control of its own borders and it's able to say, okay, Iran, come in. Now, it's asked Iran to come in for some regard, and Iran has now made a very strong case and said things like, Kurdistan, you dare be independent, we're not going to let it happen. So they're starting to make powerful statements which actually may have to result in actual action. They are likely, if in one of the scenarios I talked about, if, for example, ISIS get any more power, Iran's going to get involved. Why? I mean, if you look at the very first slide I had, the border is huge. They can't have a terrorist state right next to them, or a khilafah right next to them. It doesn't make sense from an Iranian perspective. So, number one, I think Iraqi government needs to be on board with this. But number two, they're going to be involved. They're already involved to some extent. They're making statements which are very powerful, some of which have been listened by the government, some of which from the Iraqi government, some of which have been completely ignored. But now these are becoming more powerful and more important. But the one thing I would say is the Iran-US issue is playing very hard on this. So from an Iraqi perspective, and this is potentially not a very popular thing to say, but from an Iraqi perspective, the US is the strongest, most powerful military around, by a long shot. And let's imagine if you're an Iraqi government and you've got these terrorists coming and taking your country over. You want someone to go and bomb the hell out of these people. That's the way you are. And so the government is basically wants American involvement, and they've been asking for American involvement. That's not necessarily something that Iran wants on its border. So that's another angle to think about, because Iraq may want one thing, Iran may want another. What's the right thing for Iraq to do? So those are different angles to think about. There's no clear answer, but the very minimum is Iran's involved already. It's likely to get more involved. It will not accept ISIS state on its borders, Kurdistan being independent, and a government probably in Iraq that is completely and utterly without any basis and without any sort of structure and dying, because that can't happen on its border.
Thank you very much. I know that there are still a few more questions, but unfortunately we will have to draw to a close here. Before I do close, I just want to reiterate what we can do here in the UK. It often seems like it's a very helpless situation. There is some proactive work that can be done, so please do read these carefully. If it's okay with Miqdaad, we'll make this presentation available through our website for people to refer back to, if that's okay. You don't have to say yes. Okay, great. Yeah, sorry, can we just pass the mic over here?
Just wanted to say that as a community, we're trying to work more closely with some of our Sunni neighbours. So if you see some unfamiliar faces in our community centres, please go out of your way to welcome them. And inshallah, if we have something more formal set up where they invite us, then please do put yourselves forth so we can really try and hit that first one on the head.
And there's a great opportunity coming up with the Big Iftar on the 27th, so please do feel free to invite your friends along to that. I think if we could now end with Dua Hujjah, just to pray for the hastened reappearance of Imam Mahdi. Please, if Hussein would like to recite Dua. Yeah.
Okay, so let's just remember the brothers and sisters in Palestine, Gaza, Iraq, and across the world, inshallah. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم كن لوليك الحجة ابن الحسن صلواتك عليه وعلى آبائه في هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة وليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا حتى تسكنه أرضك طوعا وتمتعه فيها طويلا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين.